I'm gonna send an audio description. We are on the we are on the headquarters of Federal Court of Accounts in the Minister of Pereira Lima Auditor. The venue's spacious accommodates 240 people. At the center of the stage setup, there are 5 armchairs reserved for the auditoriums who will be settled on stage. The decorative plants adapt to the environment. At the center, we have this blue screen in the image blue background project. In the upper left comes the word 6 all member meeting of the INTOSAI Working Group of Audit and Extractive Industry, followed by the logo of the Federal Court of Accounts. At the right side of the stage is the podium from which I am speaking. It is black and promptly displayed the TCU logo. My name is Pedro Henrique. I'm a brown-skinned man and I have average height and black hair. I'm wearing a black suit, a blue shirt, and a gray tie. We have the present authorities over here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning, everybody. You are welcome to this open ceremony of the 6th meeting of the all members of 2026, and the annual meeting that has interested straight public audit of extractive industry. We would like to inform that this event is being broadcast live on the Federal Court of Accounts YouTube channel. We also like to greet all of you that are virtual with us. It's a pleasure to have you here present or online. We also remind you that the headset for simultaneous interpretation are available in the foyer of the auditorium. And the channel will 7.2.5 for Portuguese and 7.2.1 for English. At this moment, we invited to follow the following authorities to join the stage for the open sessions. The President of the Federal Court of Accounts, Minister Vital do Rego. The Deputy Controller and Audit Generation of India and Chair of the INTOSAI Knowledge Sharing Committee, Gita Litari. Representing the Minister of Mines and Energy, the National Secretary of Geology, Mining and Mineral Transformation, Ana Paula Lima Vieira Bittencourt. The Executive Director for Governance and Compliance of Petrobras, Ricardo Wagner. The Executive Vice President for Technical Affairs of Vale, Rafael Bita. To formally open the 6th WGEI All Members Meeting to 2026, I invited the President of the Federal Court of Accounts, Minister Vital do Rego. Well, good morning, everybody. Ladies and gentlemen, first of all, I'd like to say that I'm very happy to have you all here in our country, to Brazil, and in our Federal Court of Accounts, and that we can have this meeting an interaction and efficiency that is great for all of us in the production of content that we can discuss the critical mining that we are going to discuss and searching for to work together. And with that great pleasure to welcome you to Brasília for the 6th all meeting member of the Audit of Extractive Industry, WGEI of INTOSAI, for the Federal Court of Accounts open our doors to more than 4 sister institutions from so many parts of the world is both a source of pride and profound responsibility. I'd like to begin by greeting Mr. Edward Akol, General Auditor of Uganda. Welcome, and he's chair of the WGEI, whose leadership has been instrumental for the strengthening of this forum for cooperation. Even from far, his presence honors us and reinforces the spirit of collaboration that defines this group. I also extend my greetings to Ms. Gita Litari, Deputy Controller and Auditor General of India, and Chair of the INTOSAI Knowledge Sharing Committee, one of the most important committees that we have in INTOSAI. I would also like to acknowledge Mr. Alex Comohier, General Auditor of Rwanda, who is joining us virtually, and Mr. Canvali Diamonde, President of the Court of Accounts of Côte d'Ivoire, whose presence great honor this meeting. I further extend my greetings to Ms. Ana Paula Bittencourt, National Secretary for Geology, Mining and Minerals Transformation at the Ministry of Mines and Energy, Mr. Ricardo Wagner, Executive Director for Governance and Compliance at Petrobras, and also Mr. Rafael Bittar, Executive Vice President of Vale. I greet them all with all of the delegation that are present here today, and for all those join us remotely. This week, you have made Brasília the world capital of oversight in the extractive industry. Hosting you in this institution has a special meaning for me. I often say that the work of a Supreme Audit Institution only makes sense when it reaches citizens in simple language and addresses concrete issues. And few issues today are as tangible and decisive to people's lives as the one that brings us together here. For decades, we viewed natural resources through the simple lens of abundance or the scarcity. And that time has passed, critical minerals are no longer morally production inputs. They have become drivers of transformation. They underpin the energy transition, food technological innovation, and occupy a center position in global value chains. Those who process them, and above all, those who knows how to manage them, hold a prominent place in the world that has been now being built. Brazil understands the equation well, and we also understand the limitation. We hold the world's second largest reserve of rare earth elements and nearly all known global reserves of niobium. And at the same time, only about 1/3 of our territory has been mapped at the scale required to properly assess this potential. In other words, we are one of the world's richest nations in resources that we have not yet fully come to know. Governing what is not yet fully understood is perhaps the most honest summary of the challenge we share in this room. It is precisely for this reason that the topic of this meeting, critical minerals and the energy transition and their governance implications, so accurately reflects the moments we are living through. The decisions made today in this sector shape public policies, redesign international value chains, and define development opportunities for generations to come. And decisions are made under pressure. Demand is growing faster than regulatory capacity. Short-term pressure competes with long-term priorities, and differing national perspective must converge. In this context, governance requires more than traditional tools. It requires adaptability, a broad perspective, and cooperation. It also requires our institutions to evolve, not only in their methods, but also in their ability to anticipate risks and support sound decision making in an increasingly uncertain environment. This is where Supreme Audit Institutions take on a new dimension. Our role does not end with verifying compliance after the fact. Nor should we be merely punitive institutions. Rather, we are institutions that help decision makers make better choices by identifying risks, translating technical issues to the public debate, strengthening transparency, and bringing together economy, environmental, and social considerations. Forums such as the WGEI exist for this purpose. They bring together diverse national experiences, not as standardized answers, but to improve the quality of questions, and in doing so, strengthen our collective abilities to address challenges that are by nature shared. Allow me to conclude with a reflection. The energy transition is often presented as technological challenge, and indeed it is, but ultimately is something deeper, a challenge of making sound choices in a world of finite resources. The critical minerals that makes this translation possible today cannot be viewed merely as solutions for the present. They are scarce assets whose value depend directly on how they are managed. Institutions such as ours have a responsibility to ensure the wealth extracted today is not exhausted within this generation, but instead transformed into lasting value for future generations. More than sure compliances, we are call upon to promote balances between development and perseveration, between growth and inclusion, between what technology makes possible and what nature can sustain. Because in the end, to explore the natural resources is justified only when it serves people, and that perhaps the greatest commitment of institutions such as ours to ensure that today's progress does not diminish tomorrow's possibilities. And with that spirit, I once again welcome you all, and I wish that a productive and inspiring meeting and one that generates concrete contributions to our work. Thank you very much once again. Welcome. We will now hear from the chair, Auditor General of Republic of Uganda and Chair of INTOSAI WGGI, Ms. Gitanitali. You have the floor.
relating to transparency, accountability, environmental stewardship, and equitable distribution of benefits. Strong oversight and effective auditing are therefore essential to ensuring that natural resources contribute to sustainable development and public welfare. In India, the Comptroller and Auditor General has conducted several performance audits of the mining sector covering illegal mining, revenue management, environment compliance, and the functioning of district mineral foundation trusts. These audits have identified systemic weaknesses, including illegal mining outside the sanctioned lease areas, revenue leakages, delays in royalty recovery, environmental violations, and underutilization of funds which are intended for affected communities. The audits highlighted the need for stronger monitoring mechanisms, greater use of technologies such as satellite imagery and surveillance systems, improved interagency coordination, and more effective implementation of community development initiatives. These experiences reinforce the importance of robust audit oversight in promoting sustainable and accountable resource governance. Capacity development remains a key pillar of WGEI's work. In partnership with WGEI, SAI India, through the International Center for Environment, Audit and Sustainable Development, what we call ICID at Jaipur, the global training facility for WGEI, has been conducting international training program on the audit of extractive industries. This program has enabled auditors from across the INTOSAI community to strengthen technical competencies while fostering professional networks and peer learning. At the same time, SAI India is actively spearheading capacity development in public auditing through emerging technologies. Our initiatives include a large-scale 10-month online program on artificial intelligence and machine learning for nearly 5,000 auditors, a specialized 360-degree AI/ML course in collaboration with the Indian the Indian Institute of Technology, and for SAI India's officer trainees, dedicated programs for senior management and development of AI strategy framework. Building on these efforts and aligned with India's development partnerships, particularly with Africa, SAI India has recently launched a 6-week international program on data science, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and cybersecurity audit for the officials of SAIs. The program has already attracted 60 nominations from 8 African SAIs, namely Egypt, Algeria, Gambia, Uganda, Tunisia, Tanzania, and Mauritius. Through such initiatives, SAI India seeks to contribute to the modernization of public audit practices globally through technology-driven capacity building. As the chair of KSC, SAI India is also actively contributing to the implementation of INTOSAI Strategic Development Plan 23-28. SAI India is leading the G initiative on developing a better approach to providing guidance and is a project team member of the P initiative on updating the content and presentation of the INTOSAI principles. The G initiative aims to improve access to relevant, high-quality guidance and enhance the usability of SAI-related guidance, strengthen the professionalism across INTOSAI community. A comprehensive project proposal has been developed and a survey has been circulated to gather input from all INTOSAI bodies, including KSC working groups. In addition, KSC is leading efforts to redevelop the INTOSAI community portal and modernize the websites of INTOSAI working groups and to strengthen collaboration and knowledge sharing. I'm pleased to note that the redesigned WGEI website is currently under development, and its staging version has already been shared with the WGEI Secretariat for review and comments. Our aim is to migrate all KSC working groups to the community portal in the near future, and we seek full support of WGEI in this regard. As the global extractive sector undergoes profound transformation driven by energy transitions, growing demand for critical minerals, sustainability imperatives, and technology innovations, the role of WGEI becomes even more important. By fostering collaboration, building capacity, and developing practical guidance, WGEI helps to ensure that SAIs remain prepared to address emerging challenges and provide effective oversight. SAI India remains fully committed to supporting these efforts and to advancing knowledge sharing, innovation, and professional excellence across the INTOSAI community. I once again thank the chair of WGEI, the steering committee, the secretariat, and all members SAIs for their dedication and contributions. I wish all participants a very productive and successful meeting and look forward to the valuable discussions and outcomes which will emerge from this gathering. Thank you.
Ouviremos agora o presidente do WGEI, auditor.
President of WGEI, the auditor from Uganda, Minister welcome Macau. Welcome to the Brazil. Now you have the floor.
Our host, His Excellency Minister Vital Dorego, the Chair of the INTOSAI Knowledge Sharing Committee, KSE, represented by Ms. Getali Tare, the President of the Court of Accounts of the Ivory Coast, His Excellency Kanvali Diomande, the Auditor General of Rwanda, Mr. Alexis Kamuhire, is attending online. The National Secretary of Geology, Mining, Mineral Transformation at the Brazilian Ministry of Mines and Energy, Ms. Ana Paula Lima, the Executive Director of Governance and Compliance at the Petrobras, Mr. Ricardo Wagner, the Executive Vice President of VEL, Mr. Rafael Pitar, members of the WGEI Steering Committee, representatives of INTOSAI and regional secretariats, development partners and technical experts, delegates, ladies and gentlemen, warm greetings to you all. It's an honor and privilege to welcome you to this meeting of INTOSAI Working Group on Audit of Extractive Industries in the beautiful city of Brasília in Brazil. In a special way, allow me to also recognize and welcome members and colleagues participating virtually. On behalf of the INTOSAI Working Group on Extractive Industries, and in my capacity as the Auditor General of the Republic of Uganda and Chair of the WGEI, I extend my sincere appreciation to our host, the Federal Court of Accounts of Brazil, TCU, for agreeing without hesitation to my request to host this important meeting and for their excellent arrangements that have made this meeting possible. Allow me to convey my sincere regrets for not being able to attend the meeting physically due to international public health considerations relating to Ebola outbreak in some of our countries. Nevertheless, in periods of crisis, technology has enabled us to remain resilient in pursuit of our goals. I am glad that my team and I, as well as colleagues from the affected countries, have the opportunity to participate fully and engage with colleagues throughout the week. I wish to warmly welcome all delegates from the Supreme Audit Institutions, representatives of INTOSAI bodies and regional organizations, development partners, technical experts, and other distinguished guests who have traveled from different parts of the world to participate in this gathering. Your presence reflects our collective commitment to strengthening public sector auditing and enhancing governance in the extractive industries sector. The extractive industries sector continues to play a significant role in the economic development of many countries. Revenues generated from oil, gas, mining, and other natural resources have a potential to transform societies, reduce poverty, finance infrastructure, and improve public service delivery. However, experience across the world has also demonstrated that these resources can present significant governance, environmental, social, and physical risks if not managed effectively. In this context, Supreme Audit Institutions have a critical responsibility. Through independent and professional audits, we provide assurance to citizens, parliaments, and governments on whether natural resources wealth is being managed effectively, economically, efficiently, and in compliance with applicable laws and regulations. Our work contributes directly to public trust and supports governments in achieving sustainable development outcomes. The evolving landscape of extractive industries presents both opportunities and challenges. Increasing public demand for transparency, growing environmental concerns, climate-related commitments, technological advancements, energy transition policies, and complex constructional arrangements require SAIs to continuously strengthen their knowledge, methodologies, as well as audit approaches. This is precisely why the Working Group on Audit of the Extractive Industries remains relevant and important. Since its establishment, the WGEI has served as a valuable platform for knowledge sharing, capacity building, collaboration, and development of practical guidance for auditors working in highly specialized fields. As the chair of WGEI, I am encouraged by the progress we have made together. Through the dedication of member SAIs and our partners, we have expanded opportunities for professional exchange, enhanced technical competencies, and fostered greater cooperation across regions. These achievements demonstrate the collective strength of our network and our shared commitment to excellence. Colleagues, this year's theme, critical minerals for the energy transition, governance challenges, and role of Supreme Audit Institutions is both timely and highly relevant. Across the globe, countries are accelerating efforts towards cleaner energy systems and sustainable economic growth. As a result, critical minerals have become increasingly strategic resources, essential for renewable energy technologies, electric mobility, digital infrastructure, and broader industrial transformation. Equally important is a thematic discussion on the impact of current oil and gas dynamics on governance and oversight. We all agree that the ongoing geopolitical situation is presenting challenges that are impacting economies in many of our countries. During the course of this meeting, we shall have the opportunity to discuss emerging trends, share country experiences, review progress on our ongoing initiatives, and explore innovative approaches and audit responses to such emerging challenges. I encourage all participants to engage openly, contribute actively, and share lessons from your perspective, from your respective jurisdictions. The diversity of experiences represented in this meeting is one of our greatest strengths. Ladies and gentlemen, as we look ahead, our focus must remain on ensuring that Supreme Audit Institutions are equipped to respond to emerging risks and evolving stakeholder expectations. We must continue to invest in professional development, leverage technology and data analytics, strengthen collaboration across institutions, and promote the use of international standards and best practices. I therefore call upon all members of the working group to continue strengthening partnerships, sharing expertise, and supporting one another in our common mission. Together, we can enhance the quality and impact of audits in the extractive industry or sector and contribute meaningfully to improved governance worldwide. As I conclude, allow me to express my gratitude to S&P Global Energy, the International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA, E-Plus Energy Transition Institute, the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, EITI, the Brazilian National Agency for Petroleum, Natural Gas and Biofuels, ANP, the Brazilian Petroleum Institute, IBP, the International Seabed Authority, ISA, the African Organization of Supreme Audit Institutions, English-speaking, AfroSAI, the Organization of Latin America and Caribbean Supreme Audit Institutions, OLASEFs, and the INTOSAI Group on Environmental Audit, WGEI, for volunteering to share their expertise in this meeting. Finally, to our host, the Federal Court of Accounts of Brazil, the INTOSAI community, our development partners, and all the participants, we thank you for your dedication and support. Your contributions continue to strengthen our working group and advance our shared objectives. I'm confident that our deliberations over the coming days will be productive, insightful, and impactful. May this meeting inspire us all as we strive to enhance governance and of the extractive industries in this sector. Thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you, Mr. Eduardo Acol. Para fazer o uso da palavra.
Now to have the floor, we invite the National Secretary of Geology and Energy Mineral Transformation, Ana Paula Lima Vieira Bittencourt. Good morning. On behalf of Alexandre Silveira, I'd like to greet you all. I would like to greet Minister President of the Federal Court of Accounts, Vital do Rego, and all of the members of the institutions that are present here. I'd like to greet the other authorities that are on the stage. And I'd like to welcome, on behalf of the Minister of Mines and Energy, all of the delegations that came to Brasília. It is an honor for Brazil to receive this meeting. And I confess that this is something appropriate to discuss extractive industries right here, because the topic, critical minerals and strategic minerals, are a trustworthy topic between countries, trust between governments and investors, and trust between public institutions, trust between state and society. For a long time, mining was treated as an essentially economic issue, but now it has changed. The minerals that make feasible the energy transition and the high-end technologies became a national security issue globally. I'm sorry, but today, the refining of these minerals are concentrated in a few countries, and the largest economies in the world are moving urgently to deconcentrate these chains and ensures their supply. Brazil occupies a singular position in this arrangement. We have reserves, diversified matrices, clean energy, robust environmental laws, and a solid regulatory framework. We have everything that the world is looking for, but we also have a concern. even if we have this potential, we are not participating in the high value chains stages. So the Brazilian government is asking, what position do we want to occupy in the global supply chains? For us, the mining should generate wealth for the Brazilians and add value here in the country. We don't want to only export commodities. We want that the energy transition happens here, generating more jobs and energy and economy. But it can only happen on a safe environment, business environment, and the qualities that the audit institutions here help to induce. The mining is a high risk activity of long term, and that's why it demands good public policies, regulatory stability, and strong institutions. To face these challenges, Brazil took an important step. The approval on the Chamber of Deputies, the policy about critical and strategic minerals, created with the participation of the Ministry of Mines and Energy. This is not an isolated initiative. In 2025, the Council CNPM created an interministerial working group dedicated to elaborate proposals to the development of strategic minerals in the country. This group reunited different parts of the country, like regulators and specialists, to discuss investing tools, value aggregation, sustainability, innovation, and insertion of Brazil in the global supply chains. The results provided subsidies for the legislative debate, and it ended up being discussed in the Congress as a policy. This institutional effort had the support of the Council of Mineral Policy that has a strategic role in the coordination of policies for the sector. The CNPM allows topics to be discussed in an integrated way between regulators and the other stakeholders, strengthening the mineral governance in Brazil. And we are also advancing to create a strategy for the future. The Ministry of Mines and Energy received studies that will be inputs for the government for us to discuss a national strategy of rare earths. We had the support of IDB and also participation of national and international specialists. The goal is to identify opportunities for development and also propose governance tools, sustainability, and competitive insertion of Brazil in the rare earths market. So the Ministry of Mines and Energy are seeking to contribute with the support of President Lula to create a strategy for critical minerals. What is this policy? We create mechanisms to support projects and also support the investment in the national territory, and also supports the investment in research and capacity building, because there is no innovation without knowledge. And we also establish a governance for the sector, a safeguard for sovereignty, and also for sustainability. A policy like this will mobilize resources, meaningful resources, and financial mechanisms, incentives, and new mechanisms of governance. All of this needs to be supported, evaluated, and also corrected when necessary. The credibility of the supply chain of critical minerals will not only depend on the availability of minerals, but also on the quality and oversight of the institutions. The oversight of the Federal Court of Accounts has helped us to improve our policies in mining and also to modernize the sector. The Federal Court of Accounts has been an important supporter to our Ministry of Mines and Energy. The dialogue between managers and regulators and oversight bodies are what separates a well-intentioned policy of a well-executed policy. The final goal to Brazil is to have the mining as a foundation of national development with added value, development of the local communities, environmental protection, and also international protagonism. I wish you all a great week of work. Enjoy the city, enjoy the debate, and also count on the Ministry of Mines and Energy as a partner in this agenda. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ana Paula, National Secretary. Now to use the floor, I would like to invite the Executive Director for Governance and Compliance of Petrobras, Ricardo Wagner, to deliver his remarks. Good morning. First of all, I would like to greet Minister Vital do Rego, President of Federal Court of Accounts of Brazil, and Eduardo Acol, General Auditor of SAI Uganda, and Chair of the INTOSAI WGEI, and Gitala Tare, Auditor of India, and President of the Knowledge Sharing Committee of INTOSAI, Ana Paula Vieira Lima Bittencourt, the National Secretary for Geology, Mining, and Mineral Transformation, representing the Ministry of Mines and Energy, Mr. Rafael Bittar, Vice President for Technical Affairs of Vale Company. I'd like to greet everyone, every authority present here, representatives of the Supreme Audit Institutions, public servants, and other guests. It is an honor for Petrobras to participate in this opening session and integrating a meeting of such value to debate fundamental topics for the present and for the future: governance, transparency, strategic resources, energy security, and the transition to a low carbon intensity economy. We are living a profound time of transformation, and energy transformation is not only an environmental agenda, it is in the center of the decisions in the industries and geopolitics. So discussing the critical minerals and energy and governance is discussing the foundations on what we are going to build the development in the next decades. The critical minerals occupies a position that is strategic in this process. They are essential for the technologies associated to energy transition, like batteries, electric grids, electrified vehicles, storage systems, and other solutions of low carbon intensity. So the exploration, processing, and commercial and trade involves challenges related to governance, transparency, sustainability, and security of the supply chains. This scenario imposes an important reflection. Energy transition will not be feasible only through the technology, capital, or availability of natural resources. It will also depend on the maturity level of the institutions, the predictability of the regulatory frameworks, the integrity of the regulatory process, and the capacity of integration between the institutions, the government, and the society. Brazil is an example that sustainability and energy transition can walk together. The country has an energetic matrix that has almost 50% of renewable sources. This is 3 times higher than the global rate, that is of 16%. In the electric matrix, we achieved an index of 50%, and in the transport matrix, we have 25% of renewable sources. And globally, they have only 4%. And Brazil still has an energy consumption that is below the global rate, a quarter of what is observed in the developed countries, and it shows the demand to increase the energy to support the development, social development. The big companies, energy companies that are actuating on an integrated way, they play an important role in this process. They reunite scale, technical capacity, operational experience, and investment competence to ensure the supply in high complex scenarios. And they are also called to foster the innovation, amplifying the efficiency of the operations, reducing emissions, and contributing to the renewable and sustainable energy sources. Talking about energy transition demands recognizing that this is not a simple process. It is a transformation, a wide transformation that involves technological, regulatory, environmental, and geopolitical issues. The decisions taken today will have impact on the next decades. Investments made today will change the infrastructure of the future, and choices made now will define the necessary trust to foster investments and international cooperation. In this environment, we see an increasing demand for governance models that are more robust, agile, transparent, and coordinated. At the same time, we also see the amplification of challenges in resources, investments, fiscal risks, reorganization of the global value chains, and also the need to ensure that the benefits of the transition can be distributed on a balanced way. At the same time, the regulatory frameworks that are predictable and technically sustainable are fundamental to reduce the uncertainties and mitigate risks and make feasible the investments that demand high volumes of capital. In this context, the audit institutions has a role that goes beyond the oversight. They also foster best practices of governance, contributes to the improvement of public policies, strengthens the accountability, and helps to create environmental spaces that are guided to the public interest. The role, the action of the Supreme Audit Institutions that are focused on improvement of the institutions is a fundamental asset for the sustainable development. The interaction between companies, regulators, and oversight institutions are part of an ecosystem that can conciliate energy efficiency, environmental responsibility, and public integrity. Petrobras is in this debate knowing the importance of their role. As an energy company, we have the commitment to offer energy. At the same time, we are advancing in building a future, an energetic future that has a low carbon intensity. We are acting on solid principles of governance, integrity, and transparency. These principles are guiding our decisions and sustaining our relationship with the different interests, and also strengthen our capacity to deal with the challenges on a dynamic and complex environment globally. Participating in this forum promoted by the Federal Court of Accounts and INTOSAI has a significant role for us. This meeting is a qualified space for debating between companies, institutions, oversight bodies, and specialists. This is an opportunity to share experiences, reflect on common challenges, and building understanding around topics that will be determinant for the future of the sustainable development. May this forum be a space for reflection, international cooperation, and institutional advancement, and may we turn these challenges on energy transition into opportunities for development, innovation, and strengthening of the global energy transition. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your words from the executive director from Petrobras, Ricardo Wagner. Now we're gonna hear from the Vale's executive vice president for technical affairs, Rafael Bittar. You have the floor. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to greet, first of all, the Minister Vital, President of TCU, Secretary Ana, extend this agreement to all of the authorities present here today, also online, connected to us. Welcome to Brazil. It's an honor to have this event holding here in Brazil. And I was reflecting for a period of time. I worked with mining for over 20 years, and I believe we are having talk about that like we are talking the last years. Mining is not only a topic, a business to be a strategic theme for countries. It's strategic in a geopolitical context, it's strategic in in energy security, and this is very relevant today. For those who doesn't know, Vale is the most important company of mining in Brazil. Today, we are the biggest producer of mining in the world. We are a great global company of mining with cooperation in Canada, Indonesia, and other countries. We have operations. We produce copper, nickel. We are the biggest producer of nickel on this part of the world. We have great ambitions to keep increasing our production capacity to attend, in fact, this huge mineral demand that the world has been passing through. In fact, when we think about we don't have security, there is no an energy transition without mining. There is no technology, innovation, AI without mining. This life that we know today is only possible thanks to the mining. And this essentiality of the mining is very visible today, but it's important to mention that mining should be transformed. Mining should be more connected with society. Mining was always known as an industry that is not connected with the society, and this transformation is fundamental. On the other hand, when we see mining in the world, the mining is still associated with a lot of conflicts, wars in different countries. So, in fact, mining, the only way for us to stop the illegal mining and the conflict of mining is through the legal mining and strong institution. Is the only way that we can stop that what is happening in the world, and that is get through and blocks the image of the mining. With this, we have to have those oversight procedures that we have to do. And the last years, to work in this image of mining, we launch our vision of the future mining, how it's going to be in 10 years. And we are building this mining today. The future mining is based on what? 5 pillars that I briefly I'm going to describe for you. It start with the smart operations. For those who doesn't know, the legal mining is used technology all over the processes. We have over 70 applications of AI in our chain. We have fleet of autonomous machines. We don't need operators. We have centers of control of operations, automatization in almost all of the procedures. So smart operations is a very important pillar. The other pillar are the mining that are not invasive. We have to have mines that have smaller places and recover those areas as soon as they finish the mining, and we redesignate those areas. We see a lot of cases in the world. We have a symbolic case on Minas Gerais, the state here in Brazil, that we are going to be example for the future, and example of what society is going to choose for what to use that area for. And the third pillar is to be zero waste and zero emissions. We work in our company with a lot of initiatives to reduce emissions. So even if it's navigation, we have a lot of vessels. We have been studying vessels with using methanol. We have been studying biofuel with Petrobras, and to accelerate the use of biofuels in our truck fleet, and we have other initiatives for the reduction of emissions. Today we have the biggest program of circular mining. We produce last year 26 million tons of steel from the waste. That it will everything that was waste, we took it and produced it. That was 7% of our production. We believe that in 2030 it would be 10% of the waste. This is very meaningful. It's the biggest circular mining program is here in Brazil. The other pillar that was commented today is the value sharing. The mining, it's not industry that ask of what they are mining to ask why am I mining. If I don't know how to answer why, I have to add value for the communities, for the country, for all of the institutions, and also generate this sharing value, and this is essential for mining. And the fifth pillar that I believe that is very important. I'm sorry, before on the fourth pillar, some years ago we launched a program to take 500,000 people from the poverty, and we are executing this plan. We are biggest culture investor here in Brazil and sports, showing that mining can also share value. And the fifth pillar would be the task force for the future. The workforce is going to change with this smart operations. The use of innovation and technologies is going to change, and we have to prepare those people, train them, our workers to be prepared for that. So by saying that, I'm gonna make a valley available for you as a mining company relevant and all over the world. And we also believe that that oversight is program is very important to guarantee the competitiveness from the industry of mining, and this opportunity, huge opportunity that the countries have of mining being a strategic element. Thank you very much, and good morning to you all. Thank you so much for the words, for the executive president from Vale, Rafael Bittar, for all of you that are present here and those virtual one. We have our final remarks, and this moment we are gonna have the official photograph for the members of all members meeting of 2026. For the official photograph, we kindly invite all heads of delegations and secretaries of this Court of Accounts to proceed to the entrance of the tribunal for the court at the white ramp. And for all the participants, this concludes the opening ceremony. We will take a short break with a coffee break will be served in the lobby of this building. In 20 minutes, the presentation will begin in the auditorium. We inform the foreign participation that from this moment on, the program will be only in English. So be our guests to deliver the devices for the people working in the interesting of the auditorium. Thank you very much.
markets, industrial strategy, energy security, and global supply chains. His work focuses particularly on Latin America and the strategic role of critical minerals in energy transition. Before joining S&P Global, he served in diplomatic and policy positions with the Australian government in Australia, France, and Mexico. He later led business development activities for major energy, mining, and infrastructure portfolios in the region. Matt holds a Master of International Relationships from the University of Melbourne and a Bachelor of Arts from the University of Canberra. Welcome. To moderate this session, I am going to call Alexandre Leite Figueiredo from TCU. Alexandre is Secretary for External Control of Energy Sector at the Brazilian Federal Court of Accounts, where he has served as an auditor since 2006. He has extensive experience overseeing Brazil's oil, natural gas, fuels, electricity sectors with a focus on energy governance, regulation, and public policy. He also contributes to international discussions on transparency and sustainability in the energy and extractive industries. Figueiredo holds a degree in international relations from the University of Brasília and postgrad degree in regulatory law, public law, and foreign trade. Welcome, Alexandre.
Good morning, ladies, gentlemen. It's a real pleasure to welcome all of you to this opening keynote session that we're about to start. First things first, let me start with a simple point, a statement actually. Critical minerals, they are no longer at the margins. They are at the very center of the energy transition. They are shaping supply chains, industrial policy, economic resilience, and even geopolitics at an unprecedented pace. Lithium, cobalt, nickel, graphite, rare earth elements, these are no longer just commodities. They are strategic assets at the heart of the global transformation that we are all witnessing. And this is precisely why this session matters, and matters a lot. It sets the strategic tone, the context for the conversations that we'll have over the next days during the 6th All Members Meeting, INTOSAI Working Group on Audit of Extractive Industries. And it matters because this conversation goes far beyond rising demand from renewables, batteries, electric mobility. It's also about concentration of supply, processing bottlenecks, and the growing implications for energy security and the long-term economic resilience. Understanding this dynamic is therefore paramount, essential, if we want audit approaches that truly reflect the challenges the governments, the industry, the society is actually facing. So with that, let me move straight to our keynote session. It's my pleasure to welcome Matt Blundell, who will share his perspective on the structural shifts reshaping these markets and their implications for governments and for oversight institutions. After his presentation, we'll move into a moderate session with Q questions and answers. And Matt, thank you very much for being here with us today, and the floor is yours.
Sorry, just a question on moving the slides. Great, and I can operate it from here. Excellent. Thank you so much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's such a wonderful event to be at, considering everything that's happening in the world, and for multilateralism as well as coordination across different countries and different cross-sections really sort of coming together. So it's a real pleasure to be here, so thank you for having me. And so when we talk about critical minerals for the energy transition, it's hard to not talk about geopolitics. And you know, working in this space, geopolitics and critical minerals, the permutations of both of those terms really starts to come to bear when you talk about supply chains, industrial policy, technology, as well as trade. And so there's a new critical minerals landscape that's forming. And it's one where we no longer operate in a traditional supply and demand framework. This is increasingly shaped by geopolitics. You've got policy, thank you so much, policy and technology. And historically, we thought about this sector in very simple terms. You know, prices were up, supply responds, demand rises, and investment follows. That relationship obviously still exists, but it's no longer sufficient to explain what's really happening. And so on the demand side, we're seeing entirely new drivers. We're seeing the energy transition and decarbonisation, which are fundamentally reshaping consumption patterns. You've also got structural, long-duration demand coming out of this. It's no longer cyclical. And so at the same time, you've got technologies like AI, robotics, as well as increased defence spending, which are really layering on additional, often strategic demand that becomes more price-sensitive and more security-driven. And so on the supply side, things are also becoming more complex. You've got resource nationalism, which is rising, electoral cycles at the state and federal level, which can shift policy directions, and that impacts permitting, it impacts ESG, it impacts how timelines are then translated into action. And so this provides a lot of uncertainty to project development, and I'll dig into this. So structurally, we're also seeing a shift from globalization towards regionalization and friendshoring. You've got trade blocs emerging. You've got countries increasingly using tariffs, export controls, as well as stockpiling as active policy tools. And so when you break this down, it's not only a policy-driven issue. There are certain market dynamics which are now starting to come into play. And most importantly, you've got processing bottlenecks and fragmented pricing benchmarks, which means that prices alone don't tell the full story anymore. And so the takeaway here is that we're no longer operating in a multidimensional, we're now operating in a multidimensional system where markets, policy, geopolitics are all interacting simultaneously. And so when we think about how we got here, there's been some structural demand shifts, and it's a result of a sequence of various events over the past few decades. The first phase was globalization. You know, we saw, I don't know if anyone's ever looked into an international relations course, but they often show this world map with lines being drawn all across the world, and they call it the spaghetti bowl. Because from 1990, we had 25 free trade agreements in effect around the world, and by 2015, that exploded out to 265 free trade agreements. And that convergence of industrial policy, trade policy, was really very much focused on just-in-time economics. It was focused on efficiency over resilience, and that's where you started to see supply concentration really start to develop in certain parts of the world. And so you had these globally distributed supply chains, and which were, you know, often disaggregated, specialized, and connected across borders. And this worked extremely well until this concentration started to develop. And so then came the second phase, which was the demand transformation, which we're now, you know, living at the moment, very much driven by the energy transition and digitalization. 10 years ago, we were talking about big data and the cloud. Now we just talk about AI, machine learning, and in the future, we'll be talking about quantum computing. And so these didn't just increase demand, they changed the nature of demand. They changed the nature of the materials that we use. They're more intensive, more critical, more specialized, and often harder to substitute as you move down the value chain. And so, as this has been developing in the background, you now have this new era, which I call geopolitics and security of supply, which really emerged in 2018 when the US-China trade war really came to a head. And it started to expose some of the limitations within the global system around who owns what and who dominates what part of the value chains. And so today, supply chains are no longer just economic, they're strategic assets. And so governments are now intervening more actively. And this is where SAIs really come into the discussion, because access to materials is becoming conditional, and partnerships are definitely being reshaped. And so I said 265 trade agreements in 2015. Well, that's now actually 382 in 2025. It's not that trade agreements have slowed down, it's just that they've changed in nature. So we've gone from a previous emphasis on efficiency over resilience to resilience over efficiency. And so access, risk, premium, they all start to change as a result of this. And so this key shift is really fundamental to one question, and it's, do I have the resource? And that question has been changing, especially over the last 2 years, from do I have the resource to where do I sit in the value chain? How exposed am I? Because in today's system, position matters just as much as possession. And so when we think about how we got here, over the past 30 years, processing became highly concentrated in China. And so countries spent 30 years building a full system advantage in refining and scaling new technologies. And this was a whole country effort, supported by subsidies and the development of manufacturing and industrial ecosystems across the country. And at the same time, China really secured upstream supply globally, building a technical and infrastructure platform that feeds directly into its processing capacity. And now this matters because processing is the gatekeeper for industrial value chains and the link to critical minerals. And this incredible scaling up and industrialization of this sector before demand was even there is really quite fundamental to this discussion. And the idea here is not to politicize this, it's to outline how the world is shaped today. And this is sort of the crux of the issue when we talk about the geopolitics and security of supply. And so it's not so much about share, it's also about momentum. And so while China's been able to continue to scale this rapidly, the rest of the world is still catching up in what is a very difficult space. Processing and refining of critical minerals is capital intensive, it's technically complex, it's extremely energy heavy, and it's very tightly constrained. And the margins are often much lower than at the mine site. So even though resources are globally distributed, the control is not. And so that concentration translates directly into volatility, dependency, and ultimately strategic risk for the rest of the system. And so this is why processing is so important. And this incredible scaling up and industrialization of critical mineral supply chains has seen China become the world leader in the energy transition. And their ability to develop the supply chains at a very cost-effective, in a very cost-effective manner. And so, at the same time, it combined cost advantages with global resource acquisition and tight industrial clustering, which enabled speed, scale, and dominance. And so last year, I had the pleasure of speaking with a Chinese solar manufacturer, and I asked, if you're missing one aspect of your supply chain, if you're missing one critical component, how long would it take you to get that piece? They said, well, based on where we are, the industrial hub's probably 2 to 3 hours. And I said, what would that look like for a European producer? I said, I don't know, it could be up to 6 weeks. And so this is where you start seeing the scaling up and the integration of critical minerals in a way that has not been done anywhere else in the world. And so this is where a decisive advantage comes into play in the energy transition. Control upstream translates into scale downstream, whether it's across batteries, EVs, or solar. And, I just want to emphasize this last point that, processing isn't just a step in the value chain, it's the engine that drives industrial leadership. And if you control it, you control how fast and where industrialization scales. And so when we look at, the last 15 months, ever since ever since Donald Trump came back into power, there's been a real shake-up of the global order. And a big part of it has been around critical minerals. And so when we look at this, there are some key sort of policy and alliance announcements that have occurred over the past 15 months. Major economies are listing which critical minerals are imperative to their industrial and technological sort of policy. In the US, they deemed 60 critical minerals, which is a lot. I think Brazil maybe 15. And so you start to see this scaling up of where do we put the capital, where do we put the policy, what areas do we focus on, and how do we integrate these supply chains. And so this list doesn't even include some of the efforts that have happened in previous years. You've got the US, Australia, Japan, Brazil, India, Saudi Arabia, and a bunch of other new players that are now entering this market to really find their position within these supply chains. And so from early 2025 to now, policy activity has really accelerated dramatically. You've seen executive orders, stockpiles, alliances, and capital deployment. And this isn't isolated. It's coordinated across many Western economies as well as key resource economies. And it's not just policy activity. What you're now seeing is a systemic shift in the way that the world sees supply chains. And for many years, China-centered supply chains were seen as efficient, and now for many other economies, they're seen as a strategic liability. And so you start seeing this synchronization of new announcements across different economies and governments. And this is not, it's not fragmentation by design when everyone who is capable wants a share, right? And so crucially, a lot of this has moved beyond rhetoric. We're now seeing policy backed by real capital, real money into projects, reserves, and partnerships. But at the same time, you start seeing a new dynamic starting to form around China tightening its grip through export controls, licensing, and targeted restrictions. And this is generally around quite niche products, which are much more important in criticality than in volume. And you see this from the US government as well around AI. But the idea basically is that there are some critical minerals that hold strategic leverage over others. And what that means for access in the energy transition can have sort of strong repercussions over years. And so, I was chatting to someone from an auto manufacturer from the US. And so the average cost of an automotive vehicle in the US is $49,000 at the moment for a passenger vehicle, which is a huge amount of money. And last year, when the rare earths export controls came into play, mind you, you only need about 1.5 kilos of rare earths magnets per vehicle. It's a small amount. When the controls came into play, a lot of automotive manufacturers in the US nearly shut down production because they didn't have access to this critical input. And it wasn't a volume game. We're literally talking about shipping containers worth of magnets. And so you start seeing this kind of two-way sort of effort where there's this new approach of trying to enter the market while others are trying to control it. And so this is a strategic push and pull, and China definitely holds the key levers in this space. But as you can see, we're no longer optimizing for cost, we're redesigning for control, resilience, and security. And the shift has really gained momentum, and it doesn't reverse, it just accelerates. And so when we look at it from an impact of, when we look at the pricing dynamics over the last 7 years, this is, so just to give you context, both of these graphs are indexed to 100. So the price of these metals in 2019 compared to now. And you can see absolutely massive volatility on the left as it scaled up to 200, but on the right was scaled up to 800. So you can see at different junctures, say in 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic hit, and it really forced a rethink of industrial supply chains. And then in 2022, when you had the Russia-Ukraine war, you start to see another peak around certain strategic metals because there was an over-reliance on oil and gas, and those were disrupted. So there was a push for energy transition technologies, as well as this boom in EVs in 2022 out of China. And so in aggregate, when you look at all of these different issues, you start to see that these minerals and metals have different risk exposure. They're kind of impacted by different events. And so you can't look at critical minerals as one sort of one particular issue. You need to think about the permutations that occur and their interactions with global markets. And so on the right, you've got lithium and aluminum out of the Midwest. And so lithium shot up from about $8,000 a ton to about $80,000 a ton in 2022. At that time, Mexico, where I live, nationalized all of their lithium resources. They announced it 3 times. The price shot down back to about $8,000 per ton during that period. And now, you know, this is kind of, I'll go into the commodity super cycle later, but these are some of the dynamics that have sort of formed around the world where the price spikes and you just need to jump on the chance. But these markets are so volatile that you can't guarantee that they're going to stay at that price for long. And so when we think about critical minerals, we need to understand the demand drivers. And obviously the energy transition and addition are key sort of components to that discussion. And so this is a list of some of the main sort of clean technologies that we're seeing and their materials intensity. And as you can see, you know, copper is sort of one of the main drivers for all of them, but the other main inputs for each of them are very different. And so the risk profile kind of changes by which product you then get into a market for. And so, you know, we talk a lot about copper, we talk about lithium, we talk about zinc, cobalt, but that doesn't apply to every single technology. And so, you know, even when you break down like a mobile phone, an iPhone, you've got more than 50 critical minerals in your pocket. Pulling together that kind of supply chain, that coordination, that sort of breakdown of such strategic little pieces, it becomes this new discussion around, well, how do I fit into this? How do I sort of combine industrial policy when there's so many different inputs and material intensity, when access and competitiveness are key drivers for this discussion? And so when we think about, you know, renewables, we talk about energy transition, but we also need to think about the addition. So last year, 90% of all electricity installed capacity came from renewables around the world. By 2040, we expect 75% of all electrification to come from renewables, which is a huge shift from where we were in 2010. And the issue with many renewable energies is that if not well connected to the grid, if transmission and distribution lines aren't well aligned with the sort of industrial capabilities, you then have a loss of energy. So, you know, while 75% of, or 3/4 of global electricity capacity is going to be, you know, apparent in 2040, only about 70% of all of that electricity will be transmitted to where it needs to be. So this becomes a grid issue. And so the capex needed to be able to get distribution and transmission online is about $7.5 trillion out to 2040, which is a huge amount of money. Not so much for someone like Elon Musk, but, you know, it starts to become this discussion around where does the money come from and where does it go. When you look at per capita and electricity consumption between the US and sub-Saharan Africa per capita only has 3% of the electricity consumption of the average American. And this starts to invoke new discussions around, well, what happens when there's a transition from, you know, certain parts of the world where wood and waste are being burned for fuel, to how do you then sort of expand this discussion around access to electricity, especially with climate change as another vector. You need to think about air conditioning and, you know, basically balancing that with other discussions around fertility rates in certain parts of the world, declining populations in major economies, and then, you know, the scaling up of populations in places like India and Africa. And so when we look at, you know, deeper into sort of some of the energy technologies, you've got solar. Solar is going to make up, you know, more than a third of all electricity supply by 2040. And the scaling up is going to, you know, be very quick. As it's kind of become this a lot more accepted use of technology, you start to see the cost of capital start to decrease over time. And so when we talk about, China's refining aspects, China's able to scale solar at a much cheaper way compared to the rest of the world. So when you talk about it in terms of percentages, the US capital cost per megawatt, is 54% higher than in China, and for the EU it's 116%. And I use those examples because these are some of the advanced economies that are sort of producing these at scale. So then it becomes a question of competition around here, and so this also reinforces long-term structural demand, but then competitiveness becomes a key component of this discussion. And so then when we look at other energy transition technologies, we look at, battery metals. This is sort of the big one that kind of has come out of nowhere in the last 5 years. And so when we talk about these, scaling up of demand, you've got expecting like a five times increase in electric vehicle sales over the next 15 years. In places like Brazil, I was chatting with Toyota last week, and they were saying that a big focus of their operations in Brazil is very much focused on flex technology, on biofuels, because it's a very different sort of market here. And so when you think about the different sort of economies that are looking to adopt electric vehicles, you need to then back that up with the transmission, distribution, infrastructure that allows for charging of EVs across the country. And so, when we talk about like flex vehicles with biofuels, it's another energy transition technology. And so, we need to bring that into the discussion as well. And then when we look at battery energy storage systems, this is probably one of the most sort of exponential changes that I've seen of any clean energy. Basically a very nascent technology in 2020. We're now expecting an 84x by 2040 on this technology. And so I'll go into sort of chemical compositions in a moment, because I'm sure everyone wants to hear about that, but it's incredibly important when we talk about access to critical minerals and competitiveness. So when we talk about batteries, there's this sort of duality in which kinds of batteries you fabricate. So you have the nickel-rich batteries, which was sort of the early stage battery approaches, and that's sort of become a big part of US and EU economies. But in China, there's been this massive scaling up of lithium iron phosphate batteries, which are cheaper to make and a lot more resilient. And so, when you look at the capital costs that go into being able to fabricate these, China obviously has this, is able to produce at scale and demand, and meet this demand and create the demand itself. And when we talk about energy transition technologies, we don't always want to just focus on the technologies of today. We need to think about what's coming in the future. And so in China, I've been reading about how there's the development of sodium-ion batteries, so salt, and it's going to be about 20 to 40% cheaper to be able to produce those. And that's not going to be a huge disruptor to the market. It kind of aggregates the capabilities, because that can start serving sort of cheaper EVs. And so those battery sort of vectors, they start to become more dynamic than just when we just read about one particular demand profile. And so I'd also just sort of like to talk about the geopolitical dynamics at play when we think about batteries, because this is going to be such a big component of our energy future across many major economies. And so, the war in the Middle East has really exposed just how fragile this global lithium-ion battery system has become. In the short term, the biggest impact is not so much direct mineral supply. The issue has been more about energy and logistics. Disruptions to the Strait of Hormuz have pushed oil prices sharply higher, which has been raising transport and manufacturing costs across the battery value chain. And so that's translating into real pressure on battery producers, especially for energy-intensive processes like synthetic graphite and nickel refining. And at the same time, we're seeing disruptions to less visible but critical inputs. We're talking sulfuric acid, naphtha, aluminum, And all of these are essential for processing and battery components. So the issue isn't just raw materials, it starts to become one around the entire ecosystem and all the inputs that go into a battery. And this, sort of stems from chemicals all the way to shipping routes. So when you look longer term, this is, accelerating a shift towards localized and regional supply chains, and companies and governments are investing more in domestic refining and processing to reduce their exposure to geopolitical choke points like Hormuz. And there's a real potential demand angle here as well. Like, we've seen the higher fuel prices that have come out of this energy crisis, and they could temporarily support EV uptake, although that's unlikely to be a lasting shift. Because when we talk about, the average cost of a vehicle being $49,000 in the US, it's about 15 to 25% more for an EV. And while the running costs are a lot cheaper, you start to think about, the personal finance dynamics of households and whether they can actually afford the upfront costs of getting these sorts of vehicles. And so the bottom line is, around war, it's like this kind of potential demand vector, but then the actual supply chain that sort of surrounds it starts to become really sort of disaggregated and broken down in a way that, the war isn't breaking the battery supply chain, but it's clearly showing that that the current sort of highly globalized model is becoming more vulnerable. And it's pushing the industry towards more resilient regionalized structures. And so we talk a lot about the energy transition and addition, but we don't talk too much about the new demand vectors. And so this is from a study we recently produced called Copper in the Age of AI. I'll put up a QR code at the end of this presentation. Copper in the Age of AI is an extension of a project that we did in 2022, which was focused on copper supply and demand outputs to 2040, and it was based on this idea that copper is the metal of electrification. And so when we did that study 3 years ago, AI data centers weren't a demand vector to consider, neither was defense spending, because we were so focused on the energy transition and addition that these kind of new vectors didn't really come into play. And so we've taken this approach of looking at in an unconstrained environment, that the world by 2040 will have 550 gigawatts of installed capacity. But per megawatt of IT power requires between 30 to 40 tons of copper, 59 tons of steel, 16 tons of aluminum, and then you break it down, it needs zinc, tin, 28 kilograms of rare earths. And so in aggregate, this becomes a new demand vector on its own, but it also becomes a competition for the energy transition, because these data centers need huge inputs when it comes to energy. They need huge capex as well as access to water. You've got these new discussions that are sort of developing around what is, deemed as critical for the global economy. And there's only so many parts of the world that have access to this technology. And this is where we need to have discussions around equity and, where does capital flow to and for what purpose? And so we've also included the robotics new wave. And that's more illustrative, and it's based on, certain reports coming out of the past year, including some funny videos out of China of robots dancing. I'm sure you've all seen them before. But the idea behind robotics isn't so much around, the industrial capabilities. It's not about the industrial robots that sit in a plant and they pivot and turn in and do one sort of uniform motion. This is about humanoid robotics. This is about the inclusion of AI into new sort of technologies that are going to mimic humans. And so per humanoid robot, they're about this big. I don't know if you've seen them. I've seen one from Microsoft. It's about this big. It was a little bit aggressive, I'm not going to lie. Kind of walked towards me and didn't stop. But when you break down sort of the composition of these humanoid robots, you're talking about 8 kilograms of copper. And you're going to need rare earth magnets in that, because they're the high performance magnets that can then sort of, act as sort of catalyzers for some of the movements, right? And so breaking down some of these ideas, you start to think, well, if we are facing sort of issues around critical mineral supply, and the demand dynamics just keep growing and growing, where does that leave us? I'm going to talk about that in just a second. Because I just want to quickly focus on how defense spending is also going to reshape the critical minerals landscape. Now, defense spending is important for its criticality over its volume. But the more we go to war, the more we spend money on things that explode, essentially. You know, we project a doubling of global spending on defense. So from $2.9 trillion last year to $6 trillion in 2040. And that may also scale up. And these are based on projections of, you know, commitments by economies around the world and governments around the world. But what's also interesting is, you know, the share of equipment and infrastructure that goes into this. In 2010, 24% of spending was into equipment and infrastructure. It's now up to 42%. And why is that? Well, wars are now fought with drones. They're now fought with you know, cyber capabilities. There's a bigger focus on how we remove the human in the war. And there's also a much bigger need for, you know, rare earth magnets, a much bigger need for some really niche elements of the periodic table, which I don't know how to pronounce, which then start to create new demand vectors. But the demand aggregation in that, from that perspective, becomes difficult to meet. And so this is where you start to think about, you know, who's going to pay a risk premium when there's a supply shortage. And I think this is, you know, quite fundamental to how we're starting to look at the world now. And so putting all of these together, you start looking at, you know, what are the materials required for this kind of shift. And so over the next 15 years, we expect basically a need for 50% more copper to go into the system to be able to address some of these demand vectors. So a major component of that will be, you know, 40% of that copper needs to go towards core economic demand, which is, you know, your typical infrastructure, appliances, basically air conditioning, anything that sort of starts to, that you use in a household or is used for sort of, it's more your Dr. Copper, if anyone in the room knows about that. Dr. Copper used to be a sort of key economic indicator because the copper market would move with GDP. But we're now starting to see copper move as an AI stock. It's starting to move in different ways than previously. And that's because, you know, you've got 50% of additional demand coming from the energy transition. And as I said before, you know, AI and defense, they're not going to be huge demand vectors, but when you start to see a supply crunch, they're more likely to be the industries that will be able to afford it. And then we've got humanoid robots on the end because we don't know what that's going to look like. And I forgot to mention that, you know, we don't know what that looks like now, but you have people like Elon Musk, I can't believe I'm saying his name twice, basically saying that, you know, by 2040 we could have 200 million humanoid robots in circulation. And, you know, that kind of sounds funny right now, but that could very much be a reality. We could see a scaling up that quickly. And so when we talk about, you know, the demand vectors, we talk about this huge demand, and it's like, well, how do we meet it? There's a lot of supply challenges and dynamics at play. And so one of the big ones is that, you know, when I'm just going to use copper as an example again, when we look at, you know, the projections for copper demand versus supply, we're expecting a 10 million ton demand gap by 2040. And so last year we started to see the emergence of a copper supply gap, essentially that supply will not be able to meet demand. And that's only going to get worse from 2030 because supply is actually going to tail off. And without new additions, we then become stuck in this cycle of we need more copper, but because of declining ore grades, because of a bunch of other factors around, you know, permitting, regulation, access, drill results not coming up with, you know, quality ore bodies, you start to see this new demand vector of, this new supply vector of, you know, can we meet the demand and can we scale up? And when I speak about risk premia and you know, criticality, this is the kind of emphasis that we need to make. Because we can talk about recycling. I think you can recycle 99.9% of copper. But the issue is being able to pull that together and aggregate the infrastructure around that system is really difficult. It's easy in places like Europe where it's a lot more connected, but when you're talking about, you know, reindustrialization, a demolition company, you know, they'll knock down a building, they'll take the copper and they'll sell it to a scrapyard. You don't know how much of that is going to be in circulation. So this is where you start to see, you know, new approaches and where you need to start seeing innovation within this space. And so this is where we start to get a bit more technical. You know, when we're discussing sort of mining lead times, the issue with demand these days is that it's scaling much faster than supply. And so when we break down supply, we ran this study last year of 214 mines from around the world from the 1990s. And basically what we found that every mine that has become operational since 2020 took about 17.8 years to go from discovery to production across, you know, these 5 different minerals. And so copper is at about 17 years, and then nickel 18.6. Gold is a bit more easy to extract because it's done in ounces rather than tons. But, you know, for most of these commodities and others, like cobalt, we expect supply gaps to have already formed or are forming over the next 7 years. And so supply cannot respond quickly enough. And that effectively locks in shortages over the next decade. And one of the defining features of this cycle is that developing new mines is becoming more difficult, it's becoming more expensive, and it's become more time-consuming. And so the major drivers of this sort of new dynamic is that declining ore grades require more material, they require more energy and higher costs, and then you've got persistent cost inflation, labor, energy, equipment, compliance. You know, an energy crisis doesn't just hit your back pocket, it also hits miners that need to be able to maintain OPEX as well as, you know, maintain production in a way that's economically feasible for them. And so this increasing project complexity starts to show that, you know, also starts to unravel, you know, that these geologies, these sort of ore bodies, they exist in really complicated places. They exist in mountains without access to roads, infrastructure. And so this starts to become a bigger bottleneck as well. You need to build out the system. And at the same time, a lot of the easiest deposits have already been discovered and exploited. And so future project timelines are inherently more challenging. And so that's why we're starting to see a growing reliance on brownfield expansions rather than greenfield expansions, because it's a lot easier to just sort of amplify what you've already got if you can. And they're a lot more fast, there's a lower risk, and it's also a lot cheaper. And so, you know, while you've got these brownfield expansions, it's really not going to be enough, and we still need new greenfield projects, and those come with long lead times and higher execution risks, as you can see. And so the paradox is pretty clear. While demand is accelerating, the system's ability to bring on new supply is slowing. And so when we look across 49 different countries, we're looking at, this is a slightly different set of data, but basically the average is 15 years to go from discovery to production. And essentially what the slide shows is that timelines don't just depend on geology. Each country is bound to their geology. They can't do much more with it. And so they vary significantly by country. So the average is around 15 years, but some projects take over 30 years, and others can be sort of brought online after below 10 years. And so the key driver of that gap, which may not look too obvious, is that permitting and regulatory certainties start to come into play. And so if you look at the structure of the bars, most variation happens between feasibility and construction. And that's where projects are waiting on environmental approvals, land access, community engagement, social license to operate, as well as local content laws that, you know, enable the transfer of skills and also the economic development of those communities. And I think that's a very pertinent point for many SAIs in the room. And so in some jurisdictions, you know, these processes are predictable and time-bound, but in others, they can stretch for years due to unclear requirements and overlapping approvals. So if you have, you know, state, municipal, federal elections all sort of disjointed and different parties come into play, everyone wants their own share of a mining project, and they start to change the way that permitting and regulatory certainty is structured. And this becomes a pretty critical sort of insight into how you can get projects online. And so, in this space, sort of permitting risk really becomes investment risk. It's really hard to attract investment if you have uncertainty. And so if timelines are uncertain, capital becomes more expensive, in fact, it doesn't come at all. And so when we look at exploration budgets, the commodity super cycle of the 2000s was really primarily driven by China's industrialization and urbanization. You had high demand for iron ore, copper, coal, and other commodities which surged, and prices rose sharply, and governments and companies invested heavily in new supply. And the key lesson from that period is that high prices are often mistaken for permanent scarcity. And that's happening again. We're not going through a super cycle, but what we're seeing is that there's constant fear that this is persistent scarcity. And in this case, it does look like the scarcity is going to be a lot more long-lasting. And so commodity markets tend to respond to sustained high prices with more investment. They also try to address it with more production and eventually, in many cases, oversupply. And so we learnt that demand growth does not automatically translate into long-term prosperity. And so the countries that converted their resource wealth into infrastructure and productivity and institutional strength during this period generally performed better than those that assumed boom conditions would last indefinitely. But today's cycle is very different. Demand is not being driven solely by economic growth. It's increasingly being driven by policy. You've got net zero commitments, energy security concerns, industrial policy and strategic competition, which are all shaping investment decisions across critical mineral supply chains. And you've got governments which are no longer just regulators of commodity markets. They're becoming active participants through subsidies, concessional finance, strategic partnerships, and supply interventions. And this means that critical minerals are no longer simply a mining opportunity. They're really becoming a governance challenge. And so success really depends not only on resource endowments, but on how effectively countries manage volatility, allocate public capital and coordinate industrial policy and create long-term public value. And I think for SAIs, there's a central question around, it's not whether critical minerals will be important, it's whether governments are making decisions today that remain economically and fiscally sound when market conditions inevitably change. And they could change tomorrow. That's how quickly things are moving at this stage. And so when we then look at, the balance between demand and supply, it becomes a really striking contrast. So the chart on the left are the capital expenditure commitments from 2025 to 2027 of the top 30 companies for the mining, utilities, and AI and hyperscaler sectors. So when you look at that closely, you don't really need to look at it closely to see that mining is very much underserved compared to AI. AI will receive 5 times as much expenditure. Utilities will have 3 times less. And this is where you start to see an imbalance where demand starts to move much faster than supply. And so this mismatch, this capital allocation mismatch, is really sort of fundamental to how do we see financing shift between these sectors to be able to catch up. And then the chart on the right is the exploration budgets per commodity from 2024 to last year. And basically, in the strategic metals that we put so much emphasis on nickel, cobalt, copper, you either see a decline or a very, very small rise in budgets for exploration. And a big part of this is that some of these projects are really unsustainable. On the nickel side, you've got this oversupply coming out of Indonesia, which is very much driven by this new capability of being able to turn a laterite ore, which is, for those who don't know, a laterite and sulfide ore are the 2 different types of ore that you can have in nickel. And a laterite ore is usually used in pig nickel iron, but it's never really been used for battery-grade metals. But there's a new leaching process called high-pressure acid leaching, which then allows for a greater sort of ability to use that nickel for batteries. And so Indonesia's being able to produce this at massive scale and speed, and places like New Caledonia and Australia are unable to sort of engage in this space because they can't keep their operations running at the same sort of cost effectiveness. And so you see this mismatch, right? And, you know, budgets dropped 1% last year globally for exploration. And, you know, for battery metals, that dropped by nearly half. But then you look at gold, which shot up. And so this is some of the short-term thinking that, you know, needs to be considered a bit more deeply. Gold doubled in price last year on the back of geopolitical volatility. So, you know, the money's going to where the action is, right? Where the prices are high. And that's something that we learned from the commodity super cycle is don't invest when everything's extremely high because it's not going to last for that long. And so, you know, when we then think about this from an industrial capacity and a value chain capacity, we need to really start to think about, you know, what are some of the critical junctures that are breaking down, you know, what comes out of the ground and what becomes a final input, right? And so this is also from our copper study, but it's basically a quick overview of the entire value chain for copper, right? And so over the last couple of years, I've spoken to a lot of governments from around the world around critical minerals. And one thing that's really sort of come out of this is that, you know, I used to be a policymaker. I used to be a generalist policymaker. I used to bounce around between national security issues and maybe spend 18 months on these issues. And, you know, one of the problems with doing that is that you don't become an expert in the space. You start to sort of see things from face value and, you know, you read the news and you sort of understand it, you write the legislation and then you move on. And so one thing that's really come out of, like, last 2 years of discussions is I've met with a lot of policymakers who have said, well, the further you move up the value chain, the more value there is. You know, the further you move, every step that you take, there's going to be aggregated value. But in this space, refined production starts to become a really critical bottleneck within the critical minerals paradigm. And so one of the major sort of developments that sort of occurred in this space is that, you know, every mineral really behaves differently from one another. You've got declining ore grades, yes, so it's harder to get, you know, volume, but that also means that impurities are higher, they're rising. So processing is getting harder and not easier, and scaling is also a major challenge. Many technologies, like the high process acid leaching that I spoke about before, for nickel or rare earth separation, they look viable in theory, but frequently struggle or fail at commercial scale. And so, especially when we talk about the rare earth example, it's, you know, not a huge volume game. So how do you then aggregate demand in a way that's feasible to start a refinery or a processing facility? It's not the same sorts of volumes as, you know, you see in the oil markets. And so, you know, when you look closer at the refining and processing aspect of critical mineral supply chains, they're also extremely capital and energy intensive. These are multi-billion-dollar projects. You know, I think I heard a quote of $5 to $6 billion to be able to get an aluminium refinery up and running, and it could take 5 to 7 years. And so these also have long payback periods because the margins are much less than at the mine site. And so the costs are highly exposed to power prices and chemical inputs. And so when power prices are shooting up, chemical inputs are shooting up, it becomes really untenable without sort of government subsidies and you know, help to be able to navigate this. And so even once built, these refineries are really difficult to operate. Ramp up is slow, recoveries are uncertain, and output often falls short of expectations. And so the key point is that, you know, and notwithstanding that the constraints in being resources in the ground, but in this space, it's the ability to turn those resources into usable materials at scale, even when the margins are smaller than the mine itself. And I know that we're all meeting here from extractive industries, but this is, you know, a critical part of turning your resource endowment into an industrial value chain into the future. So I'll dig into some of the, you know, the key sort of dynamics that need to come in. But, you know, what I also wanted to say is that when we talk about refining and processing, there's also the economic viability aspect of it. You know, even if you solve the technical challenge of being able to get a a refinery up and running, the bigger issue is often the economic viability. And, first, refining faces very high ESG and regulatory barriers, especially around emissions, water use, chemical processing, and it makes permitting really slow and more expensive. And then second, these markets, they're highly volatile and often lack transparent pricing benchmarks. They're very opaque. And so, and this is very particular to processed materials. So that makes revenue uncertain, which also discourages investment. And then third, there's the structural sort of competitiveness gap. China dominates refining with lower costs, scale, and policy support, and it makes it difficult for new projects in other regions to compete. Last year, I think Glencore shut down a copper refinery in Australia, and the Australian government then had to jump in to be able to save it from being, to make it economically viable, because this is where you get that juxtaposition between, being market-led and when government is, providing certain inputs to be able to keep, and sustain and maintain production. And so finally, demand risk is real. You've got buyers, particularly in batteries, which are slow to qualify new suppliers, because along this value chain, you've also got new approaches to transparency. In the banking sector, you have know your customer. In this space, it's really know your supplier. And so you want to be able to know that there's traceability mechanisms behind all of this, and you're not just sourcing from, illegal mines and processing these ore bodies. And so the challenge isn't so much about building projects, it's building projects that can compete, that can secure customers and remain economically viable over time. And so, the value is really shifting towards integrated systems. I'm throwing up a few examples here of recent sort of offtake agreements that trying to get from the mine to the industrial production site. And I've just included some examples from the US and Europe, specifically because when we talk about China's ability to scale up, it's very much driven by a very centralized sort of approach through subsidies and state-led policy, which is very continuous. And so for many other countries, they need the market to sort of run their own approaches to this sort of new paradigm. And so the first example I've got up here is General Motors, which has invested $650 million into Lithium Americas, specifically in a mine site called Thacker Pass. And the idea is that they become the off-taker for this project because it's difficult to be able to get this off the ground without, the end of the supply chain involved. And essentially, with this 38% ownership structure, they get the lithium. It gets turned into battery-grade lithium at the site. They then send it off to a third party to be able to produce the battery cells, and then that goes into their electric vehicles. And so they've managed to find a new way of securing supply. And this is starting to become, a new sort of discussion in the critical minerals space. The second one is MP Materials, which has been in the news a lot, and it's sort of got its advantages and its risks. But essentially, the US Department of Defense invested about $450 million into MP Materials, which is a rare earths producer and refiner. And basically, this is a new sort of approach for government procurement and funding, which really kind of anchors the supply chain. And this is especially where markets cannot support the investment because it's not economically viable. So this is where you start to see state interventionism in the market to be able to make, where you can link sort of national security and endeavors to economic viability, essentially. And then the third one, I won't go through all of them, but the third one is a really interesting one from Rio Tinto. They have a small company called Newton Copper. And so Newton Copper is a sort of startup pilot project from Rio Tinto where they've advanced this new bioleaching process where they can basically take low-grade ore and then convert it into a grade A copper cathode. Rio Tinto doesn't actually own the mine site. This belongs to someone else. But their involvement in this then supplies the copper cathodes to Amazon Web Services. So Amazon then secures the copper to be able to deliver to their AI components, but Amazon Web Services then using their technology, their AI and sort of machine learning to be able to monitor the process and help develop the technology in a much more innovative way, to be able to look at it from a data perspective to make it more efficient. And so if that kind of technology can scale up, you can start to meet the demand gaps that we're facing over the next sort of decades. I don't know how I'm going for time, but I'm about to finish. So then when we think about, building out competitive industries for critical mineral supply chains, we think about ecosystems. We can't just, finance a project and then expect that that's all that's going to happen. You need to think about how do you integrate, reliable and affordable infrastructure? How do you get the roads, the electricity, the supply chains in motion that can basically get ore out of the ground to where it needs to be? How do you build out the refining capacity near the mine site? Even being in Brazil, gave a talk last week, and someone came up to me and they said, well, one of the big issues that we have at the moment is access to ports, because of Brazil's massive agricultural industry and other export industries. Actually getting access to the ports to be able to send critical minerals away is becoming increasingly difficult. So this is where you start to need to develop sort of more integrated and coordinated approaches to how you look at public policy. And so I spoke before about, permitting and risk and regulatory certainty, which sort of underpins all of this. And then maybe thinking about how you can regionalize and integrate different sort of industrial corridors in a way that allows for, different stages of the supply chain to be able to capture that value and that sort of segment within the supply chain. When we think about financing and risk mitigation instruments, this is, really imperative to SAIs, I think. There's a real issue for many governments around the world where they want to help structure a loan for a mining project, but as you saw with the pricing volatility that just keeps shooting up and down over the years, they can't guarantee those offtakes. They can't guarantee those loans because they don't know what the price is going to look like in the future. And so this starts to become a really sort of imperative aspect of the entire ecosystem. And then, we also talk about transparency. We talk about traceability, ESG. I know I said before ESG burden. I don't like saying that because I think ESG should be integrated at every stage of the supply chain, but it becomes burdensome when those extra costs start to pile up. It's incredibly important, but this is also this, how do you make it economic? How do you basically scale it up in a way that makes it easier to maintain? How do you engage communities early on in the process so that you don't face issues downstream? And so this is where we also start to talk about, having a technically proficient workforce. In the critical mineral space, there are so many different aspects of every single supply chain. Nickel processing looks vastly different to lithium processing. It looks very different to copper processing. When you talk about being at the mine site as well, you're often operating in very remote areas where you need to be able to develop knowledge transfer and capacities within those regions. And so how do you integrate education into that? One thing that China has done exceedingly well in this whole sort of building a proficient workforce is that there are sort of statistics that I've seen where every year about 5,000 students graduate across mining and metals and metallurgy university programs in China. 5,000 students. In the US, that's 300. So you need to build out the base through a capable workforce that is able to specialize in some of these, because rare earths processing is not the same as copper processing, for example. And so when we think about the trade-offs that policymakers and investors make in this space, you need to I've broken it up into sort of 3 different segments. If you want efficiency in terms of capital deployment as well as workforce deployment, you tend to look at market and demand-led aspects. This is where the private sector really sort of jumps in. They're able to innovate, they're able to, generate revenue a bit faster. But when it comes to those early stage segments or those national security sort of or strategic segments of the supply chain, that's where they may underinvest because it's not as profitable. So this is where the state then needs to come into play, whether it's addressing the system gaps through policy or legislation or financing, but also how to build that platform where capital pull through incentives as well as regulation and tax structures and incentives kind of can help catalyze that investment. And so then we also look at alliances. A lot of countries in this room are part of different alliances. And alliances are really important in the critical mineral space because you can start sharing sort of resources, you can sort of develop new sort of mechanisms. But what happens if that left-wing government that you partnered with 2 years ago then changes to a right-wing government and that then sides with one particular country? What happens if across that spectrum of global countries you start seeing fractures sort of developing? And so this is where alliances are really sort of critical but also need to be considered. And then I think the last one is probably the one that need to be most careful with, and I call it protect and control, and this is where sovereign capture comes into play. That example of Mexico nationalizing all of the country's lithium is a good example of that. Indonesia's sort of export controls around nickel and their quotas around nickel is sort of an example of that as well. So sometimes those sorts of efforts can discourage investment, especially nationalization, and can also lead to sort of fragmentation risk within markets. And that can be hard to come back from long term. And so just to wrap up, as the world is sort of reshaping at the moment, we're seeing, this real fluctuation in who belongs where and who owns what and who is trying to find their way into different markets. There's also a strategic window to become part of the supply chain, to become part of the value chain. And so understanding where your position may lie is, fundamental to this. You may not be, endowed with all the critical minerals of the world, but if you can find your space, especially in the energy transition sector, to find how you can sort of develop your capabilities, this is really important because your competitiveness relies on the infrastructure that you build out around it, the policy certainty, the regulation incentives, and then the partnerships that you developed either domestically or internationally. And so, I've seen a lot of people take a photo of this particular slide, but I'd just like to emphasize that, I think one of the key sort of takeaways in this space at the moment is that whatever you do, do it with conviction and do it with, a level head about what you're sort of, the way that you engage with the critical minerals framework, because there are so many different critical minerals that need to be sort of understood and developed, but where you position yourself is the most critical aspect of it. And with that, thank you.
So, thank you very much, Matt, for such an insightful and thought-provoking presentation. Thank you for that. You started talking about the new critical minerals landscape, really interesting. And you've reaffirmed what I've said earlier about critical minerals being treated and should be treated as strategic assets. So I really agree with you on that. And you said something that was really provoking for me, that position matters as much as possession. So it highlights the importance of supply chains, of processing. And when you mention that governments are treating concentrated supply chains as vulnerabilities to be treated, it really shows us how important critical minerals are now when it comes to geopolitics. It's not only about the economy, it's about resilience, long-term economic resilience. So I want to highlight that as well. And when it comes to the demand drivers and its implication, thank you for bringing us the copper in the age of AI. Really interesting. I'm really looking forward to read the whole study. And the fact that defense spending is increasing, require additional copper and other critical minerals. So it adds to the whole energy transition as a potential huge demand driver as well. And when it comes to supply challenges and its dynamics, really interesting when you mentioned the copper supply gap, right? That despite global demand accelerating, current supply is projected to decline. It's obvious. A problem that's ahead of us, and we should do something to try to avoid it. And one thing I'd like to highlight is when you said the politics is now a demand driver, right? For instance, the net zero agreement. So the governments, they are looking for critical minerals, again, not only for economic purpose, but because they have to comply with the international contracts, arrangements they've already made. And that's how the world works. And just to finish what you said about the capital allocation mismatch, it seems to me like a paradox. When mining capex commitments and exploration budgets, they dwarf in comparison to AI spending. AI is not going anywhere without the critical minerals. So it's something that we as Supreme Audit Institutions, we should look at really intensively, because that's a really strategic gap that we should address, try to help our government to address. So just to wrap up, you've helped us to frame the discussion by showing us how critical minerals are central to the energy transition, but with far-reaching implications for supply chains, industrial policy, economic resilience, and of course for energy security. And that, and for the reason, it puts the critical minerals squarely and fairly on the radar of Supreme Audit Institutions. So with no further ado, let's get straight to the Q&A session. I think we have a short time for that, but I may take advantage of the fact that I have the mic now, so I'll start with two questions. The first one, where should Supreme Audit Institutions focus their scrutiny? When it comes to critical minerals, what are the blind spots in government preparedness and policy implementation? I'll make the second one and you can answer. And the second one, how do governments enforce what were mentioned before, the trade-offs? How they actually avoid the false trade-offs? How can they secure supply and boost competitiveness without compromising, for instance, environmental safeguards and maybe long-term economic resilience?
Well, thank you very much. And coming into today, I had a feeling that auditing institutions would ask the most insightful and often difficult questions. So for the first question, I would probably address permitting and regulatory regulatory sort of predictability. I think this is where you start to see, especially in a lot of democratic governments, where leadership can change very quickly across different state levels. And so when you're talking about federal government sort of involvement, understanding where you can set the fiscal terms, the tax incentives, and the permitting requirements in a way that sort of projects, not only to get a mine online or to get a project online, but how you then develop that in a way that leads to long-term sustainability. I'll use an example from Mexico again. There was a big mining reforms a couple of years ago, which has really sort of impacted investment in the country, in the sector. And a lot of it was actually premised on building out ESG requirements, which there were certain aspects of the Mexican mining industry which was very much kind of a Wild West situation where operators would just do whatever they needed to get things out of the ground and that sort of thing. So there was this kind of push for greater sort of application of the law, but then it also stymied some sort of investment aspects. And so one of the things that, I've lost my train of thought here, but basically when they first rolled out the legislation, they said that, mining concessions would go from 30 years to 20 years. And for many miners, as you saw with that graph earlier, 20 years, you may only be 2 years into production. So, and if you lose that concession at the end, where's the profitability? You've just spent 17, 18 years basically building out that sort of that sort of supply structure, and then you're not going to be able to capture the value. So I think, that the previous slide that I showed, I might grab the clicker actually so I can go back through a couple of these. But when we look at this slide here, the idea is not that you apply these different sort of regimes, you choose one and you stick with it. You kind of bounce between the different sort of approaches. So, for certain aspects of the supply chain, you might want it to be market-led, which then sort of generates the, financing of projects, but then you need to balance it out with, say, the state. And I spoke about this before, but, the state involvement can then sort of amplify some of those sort of critical gaps and address with those financial incentives. And you can look at it for different strategic metals. You don't have to just apply that across, down upstream. You can apply it to that particular metal that needs to come out of the ground. And so this is where I think SAIs can really sort of get involved, is to be able to develop the, the capacities of the state to be able to first sort of develop the investment sort of conditions, but then also to be able to provide the infrastructure that comes around the mine site, and also develop that ecosystem that I spoke about. I think that the ecosystem is really fundamental to the critical minerals sort of paradigm at the moment. You hear about, big announcements of this mine's going to come online in 5 years and we've invested X million dollars, but that doesn't really mean anything unless you have the, infrastructure sort of around it, the whether it's sort of government-led or market-led sort of approaches to developing the communities as well. And so I think there needs to be sort of this lockstep between the public and private sector that needs to be sort of considered for it to be able to function sort of appropriately. When it comes to factoring in, the second question was around ESG and sort of the trade-off with costs. Well, that's a really hard question. There's probably a lot more people in this room that sort of live that day to day. But, as the world becomes a lot more fragmented in this space at the moment, you can't help but think about, COP30, the COP31 process. Brazil was the host of COP30 last year. And, we, as S&P, we made a big point of it last year to make sure that critical minerals entered that sort of discussion, that policy discussion, that it got on the action agenda for COP30 to COP31, because critical minerals for the energy transition is fundamental to the way that we look at decarbonisation and the way that we sort of look at, ESG and that sort of thing. And so when you look at it from a macro perspective, critical minerals feeds into that. But when you look at it from a sort of more micro perspective of the, building out the supply chain or building out, like we always just throw around ESG, but building out the environmental aspects of the upstream project, what does biodiversity look around the mine site? What does, from the social side, which communities are sort of not willing to engage, which ones need to be more engaged? How do you build out the capacities within that space, the knowledge sharing to be able to build up the community around that project and benefit from it, both economically but also from like a human capital perspective? And then on the governance sort of side, these are all sort of seen as costs incurred, but they're sunken costs. And when you've got a project that goes for 30, 40 years, there's such minimal costs over the long term. So, if governments can sort of invest in that space and help build that out, then it makes projects a lot more viable from an ESG perspective. I don't know if that answers your question. Kind of sound like the ramblings of a madman by this stage.
Thank you, Matt, for the answers. I'd now like to open for a few minutes for questions. I'd like to collect questions here.
Just before we start, I've just put up the QR code for the Copper in the Age of AI study. So that's, will show all the demand vectors that I've spoken about and a much bigger breakdown of everything going on. Sorry, after you.
Thank you, Matt, for this very insightful presentation. Question, we are looking for these critical materials because we need them for clean energy, for decarbonization. However, they are produced in a very dirty way themselves. They need a lot of electricity. They also need carbon. Brazil is one of the countries that is producing very clean. It has a lot of renewable electricity, renewable carbon. But last week I read that even Brazil is under threat because cheaper materials are being imported from Asia, even if they are not produced as clean. My question is, how can we ensure that not only the use is clean, but that the production is clean? How can we make sure that there's a market for green silicon, green manganese, green nickel, so that countries that have abundant mineral resources, but also renewables, can benefit from this power shoring, can benefit from this economic development by delivering a green solution for a clean tech industry? Thank you.
That's a great question. The kind of example that I gave around Newton copper before kind of feeds into another example that I had on there, which was LKAB, SSAB, and Volvo, which are steel producers and auto manufacturers. And when we talk about these often very dirty processes, recycling, the processing and refining can be very sort of energy intensive, demands a lot of water. There needs to be innovation in this space, right? And innovation can only really occur from the investment conditions for companies to actually get involved in projects. So there's a lot of new innovations around sort of processing especially, and also getting ore bodies out of the ground. How do you use AI? How do you use these new sorts of geological mapping approaches that have come out of this sort of AI revolution? But how do you also scale it up? So you have a lot of different sort of technologies that are coming about, but a lot of them don't get the seed funding to be able to scale up because, they can't prove themselves. And I think that what we're going to see in the next few years is, money and policy goes to where there's the most noise, right? And so in the critical minerals space, I've said this a couple of times in the last week in conversations in Brazil, but when we talk about these sort of big geopolitical issues, national security issues, sometimes they only get enough attention for maybe 2 or 3 years. I'm sure a lot of people in this space have sort of seen that. I used to work on transnational serious and organized crime. Within 2 years, the policy funding kind of changed. And then I moved to cybersecurity for critical infrastructure. We sorted it out through legislation and put some money towards it, and it stopped becoming a mainstream media issue. And so the time for action is really very much now when it comes to putting money and policy towards innovation, especially in the extraction space, as well as the refining and processing space, because as these ore bodies become dirtier and they're harder to separate, the ore from the rest, it starts to become this issue of scalability, higher intensity costs, and so the solution that we've found through human history is every time we've had an issue, we've sorted it out through innovation. We've come up with new technologies. And so there's a really good opportunity now to use, this AI. I mean, it's such a juxtaposition, this entire kind of scenario that we're seeing where, we need to supply AI, but AI can actually be one of the things that will fix the problem. And so how do you apply machine learning to certain processes And I think there's quite a few sort of companies around the world that are starting to develop these capabilities in a way that should kind of give us a little bit of hope for the future as well. I know that sometimes when I speak, I sound like the saddest person in the room, especially when I talk about geopolitics and critical minerals, but I am seeing, a lot of innovation in this space. I'm seeing, we run this big conference every year in Houston called Sarah Week, and we have the executive conference and we have the Agora. And the Agora is the innovation Agora, where we have all the new technologies that are coming up at the moment. So there's even, companies that are focused on like seabed mining, for example. I know you have the Seabed Authority coming, but you have like seabed mining, you have new processing technologies, how to better use water in some of these processes instead of chemicals. And so those technologies, they kind of are born in that space, and then a couple of years later, you might see them in the executive conference where you have ministers and CEOs discussing these issues. So, we really try and focus on what does the future look like as well, because without innovation, you kind of find this kind of critical juncture of, everything's just going to become harder and harder, and no one wants to invest. And this is where, need to commend China's technological innovation in this space as well. They've been able to make massive inroads in scaling up these technologies and also creating these technologies. So, yeah.
I think we have room for one more question.
Thank you so much. It was really a great presentation, very insightful. I'm from the Auditor General's Office of Norway, worked with the African countries in capacity building. So this area of a lot of interest. We've been training quite a lot on, on the contracts and the fiscal and tax incentives. So looking from the other side, there are observed a number of transfer pricing issues as well. But I will just link this to, you said in the presentation, not much of the revenues stay in the countries where it's extracted. Mm-hmm. So one thing I'm wondering, who gets the benefit and the revenue? And tax incentives, do you have any, could you elaborate a bit more on that? How can it benefit both the investors and others and the countries itself? Thank you so much.
Yeah, great question. I might just go back to this slide on the copper value chain. So when we talk about value capture, at different stages of the supply chain, you can multiply your revenue, essentially. So I was chatting with a Brazilian lithium producer. They said, well, to turn the ore into concentrate, it's very easy, and we get 50 times more revenue from it as a result. When you look at, exporting, producing global mined copper, you've got Chile and Peru, which produce 40% of global copper. But you don't look at them as industrial powerhouses, and you don't, they're great economies, but you don't see them in the same way that you do the US, EU, China in terms of industrial capacity. Because the capacities, they do refine and process copper, but they don't sort of venture down the value chain. So this is more illustrative, this example, but actually last night I was looking at the different sort of multipliers of different metals. But, say you start with 1x at the copper ore. You may, once you produce it into a concentrate, you may have increased the value 4 or 5 times. But then when you get to sort of refining and processing, you may be looking at sort of 5 to 8x, depending on the processing capacity of that metal, and sort of the value that comes out of that. But then as you go further downstream, you start developing the components, and that's when you start to sort of see 10 to 15 times the revenue on the ore. And then when you get to the final component, say an EV or something like that, you may be 20 to 25 times that revenue. So the revenue capture and sort of the inputs kind of develops as you go further along the chain. The critical choke point at the moment is refining and processing, because it's always in the too hard basket. It's very energy and capital intensive. And so a lot of countries will just say, well, let's just export the ore, because, you know, in the copper value chain, I think it was before processing, you know, you get 96, quoting a colleague that told me this the other day, but I think you capture 96% of the value from just exporting the concentrate compared to the refined product. So the margins are very small. And so, you know, you kind of need to cross that hurdle, otherwise you're importing refined and processed copper from different parts of the world, essentially. So you start to see these different dynamics, and the only country that, you know, you see kind of developing, that has developed the capacity for importing and sort of processing is China along that value chain. And then more than a third of all sort of copper content components come from China now. But I think they only have like less than 5% of global reserves and production. So when you look at a country like Chile and Peru, you know, where would they sort of capture the value in that value chain? Well, it's just kind of easier to ship out the concentrate and then not worry about the rest, because setting up the value chain is going to take a lot of time and a lot of money. So this is where I think, you know, SAIs can really sort of look long-term rather than short-term, especially when we look at different sort of metals. You know, the price may spike and then all the money floods to that particular sector. I'm sorry, your second question. Tax incentives, yeah. So an example that I've seen in the past couple of years is Argentina. Argentina's RIGI scheme. I think it's for projects across strategic sectors. And when I say strategic sectors, I mean a lot of sectors. You're talking tourism, infrastructure, mining, energy, lots of different sort of strategic sectors to sort of get the Argentinian economy up and running again after such a long period of inflation. They basically created this tax incentive scheme where if you're investing $200 million into a project, I believe it's tax-free, and then there's, I've forgotten the sort of core components of that policy, but it has basically galvanized the mining industry to go and invest in Argentina. So for context, when we talk about copper, so Argentina is known for its copper, lithium, gold, silver. But when we talk about copper, it's got the 6th biggest reserves in the world, which is massive. But it only produced 4,000 tons of copper last year, which is absolutely nothing. If you compare that to Chile, they produced 1 million tons of copper last year. So they're basically creating the tax incentives to be able to scale up these projects. And so a lot more miners are being able to access, because of that tax incentive and some sort of regulatory certainty. I think they've got like 30 years of regulatory certainty where basically under legislation, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't know if any Argentinians are in the room, but basically you can know that your project will be safe over those 30 years. That's one example. I mean, there's other issues downstream around sort of ESG and other aspects, but in terms of mobilizing capital and mobilizing interest, you know, I spoke to a few miners about Argentina and they said, we're flooding there because the conditions are great, because they're going to build out the infrastructure or they're letting us build out the infrastructure. But basically, they've become the platform that the government has become the platform that allows for that investment to sort of springboard. Yeah.
So thank you again, Matt, for all the insightful thoughts you brought us here, the discussions and so forth. I hope we'll have other chances to deepen the subject. And thank you all for sticking around, for those who are online as well. So that's the end of the morning session. We'll now have lunch. So I ask all those delegates from the WGEI that will meet outside for the lunch. And of course, you as well, Matt. And we'll be back at 2:30 sharp to the afternoon session. Thank you again. And good lunch to all.